κόμβος ελληνισμού και μελής ορθοδοξίας. The center of Hellenism and Orthodoxy.
Is a vibrant Hellenic Cultural Center for not only us here in the community, but for all over the world. To preserve the past, but also to perpetuate the future.
Good evening. As our lovely director of this wonderful institution said previously, I am Father Patrick O'Rourke, the Dean of Students here at Hellenic College Holy Cross. But about 12 years ago, almost 13 now, I was Scott Patrick O'Rourke, a wayward college graduate who had just completed a postgraduate fellowship in Philadelphia and who had just moved for a summer to Charleston, South Carolina, to live and work with master craftsman and artisan Andrew Gould. Andrew, if you're unaware, Andrew designs Orthodox churches. He designs everything that goes inside of a church, from Anastasis to vestments to windows. But I didn't go there to work on architectural things alone. One of the things that Andrew asked me to help with was my most recent professional endeavor, which was journalism. He asked me to come and help establish the Orthodox Arts Journal. And he told me that it would be a 3-person team that would start this. Andrew, myself, and some guy up in Canada named Jonathan. Jonathan Pajot is how I used to say it before I learned better. And so almost 13 years ago, I met Jonathan through the phone. We've had many conversations. We've worked on a few different projects, and I've even helped him with some of the things that he's done recently. For those of you who are unaware of Jonathan's full trajectory, he was very much what you would call a starving artist, as an icon carver. And the Orthodox Arts Journal was his first foray into expressing his thoughts and his interpretations of symbolism within the confines of ecclesiastical art, primarily in iconography. And for about 5 years, Jonathan did that and was well received. He went from being Jonathan Pajot, a guy in Canada that I talked to on the phone, to somebody whose thoughts and insights I deeply valued and took into myself and started to look at the world through the lenses that he was giving myself and others. He took that as a springboard to create what now everyone knows as the symbolic world, a series that started off primarily online, which has now grown into an IRL presence in real life, with a recent and very successful Symbolic World conference. Jonathan has a wonderful way of expressing these truths that symbolism helps us digest and understand from within the church, but now outward into the world. And in that way, I think he is a wonderful paradigm for all of us to learn, to internalize, and then to share outside of the confines of our own ecclesiastical environment. So I hope and I pray that tonight, through his wisdom and his words, each of us may take in some of these insights and start to form our vision of the icons of Holy Week so that we can encounter them through their symbolism, being transformed by them. Then we can share those truths in symbols with the rest of the world. With no further ado, it is my joy and my honor to introduce to you a friend that I have now made after 12 years in real life, Mr. Jonathan Peugeot.
So it's a great joy to be here. For several years now, I've wanted to come and visit Holy Cross, Hellenic College, and so this was a great opportunity to come. I want to thank especially Dr. Timothy Patitsas, who I've become friends with over the past few years, whose thought is, I feel, very, very close to mine, expressing the deep truth that we find in our tradition in a manner that can also help to heal the world, through beauty and through these patterns of being. And so, on my YouTube channel, I talk about all kinds of things, but obviously what I really love to talk about is icons and the powerful symbolism that we find in them. That's where my root is. And so, if I'm going to speak at an Orthodox college, obviously I'm going to talk about icons. And so, as we have Holy Week coming towards us very soon, I thought it would be wonderful to go through the icons that we see during Holy Week as they follow the story of the Passion, of course, but also that I believe that the succession of the icons and what we find in those particular icons, they reveal to us a mystery about the Passion, about the Incarnation itself, one that we also find in the hymnology as well, and it's something of the deep paradox of the Incarnation. The deep paradox of Christ, how he is both the God-man, but also is the one who ends up horribly crucified on the cross. And so in the icons, we kind of see that we see these extremes being put up against each other. And so we're going to go through some of the icons and look at the symbolism that is shown there. And so we're going to turn it on. There you go. All right. And so we're going to start with Palm Sunday, the entry into Jerusalem, and here we really see there are different aspects of the way we represent Christ. The iconography of Christ is to represent him as an emperor, really, to represent him as this glorious character. The way that Christ is dressed in our icons, he's dressed as a Roman senator or a Roman nobleman. Jesus was probably not dressed that way in first century Galilee, with the clavi, this sign of nobility on his cloth. But it was in some ways, as Christian art started to develop, it was a way to signify that he was the king. He was the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so in icons like the entry into Jerusalem, this is what we're seeing. The image of the entry into Jerusalem is based on the images of the images of the triumphal entry of emperors. So when you look at the images of the triumphal entry of different emperors into Rome after their conquest, this is the pattern that they would have. You would see him on a horse coming in and the people greeting him as he entered into the city. Of course, it's not a stretch because that is how it's described in the Gospels, because that is what was happening. The people were, even if in a very kind of tenuous way, it seems that they were welcoming their king, and they were treating him as a king and as an emperor as he was entering into the city. This image of the entry into Jerusalem is really one of the oldest images. As soon as Christian art starts to flourish, we already have the type appear right away. So this is a 4th century image of the entry to Jerusalem on the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus. And we see that almost all the elements that we still have today in our icon of the entry to Jerusalem is there. You have Christ coming in, sitting on a donkey. You have someone climbing up in a tree that is going to cut down the branches. And then you also have a child putting his vestment under the feet of the donkey. So this is what we're seeing here. Christ is coming to the city. He is the glorious emperor. And what's interesting about this as well is that Christ is sitting on a donkey. Now, why is he on a donkey and not on a horse? There are different interpretations, but the one that I find the most interesting is actually the one that is parallel to the interpretation that is still current among Jews today. It's the one that Origen, kind of teases out as he was in contact with rabbis of his time, which is that the Messiah sitting on a donkey he's sitting on an impure animal. And what that means is that he's actually sitting on the nation of the Gentiles. Like, he's ruling the Gentiles. He's ruling the impure folks, the people that aren't us. And that ruling them, he is now coming, having conquered them, into Jerusalem. And this is the interpretation that Origen takes, and it's one of the interpretations that is kept in the Church Fathers after him. What's fascinating about it is already in this image, and already in the way that Christ is riding the foreign nations into Jerusalem, there's already the paradox of what it is that Christ is going to do and what it is that Christ is going to be. Because, you often hear, the more cynical Bible scholars who say everybody was expecting a king that would deliver the Jews, and what ended up happening was that he was killed, and therefore the promise wasn't fulfilled, right? That's what they were expecting. But the truth is that Jesus did conquer Rome. I mean, it took 300 years, but he did conquer Rome. And he did it in a manner that was very different from how people usually conquer cities. He did it from the inside through a type of transformation which was not a military conquest, but was a deep inner transformation that was related to what it is that Christ is going to show all during Passion Week. But what we do see in the image, of course, is this powerful image of the king that is coming into the city and is being received by the people, celebrating him as the king. Now, in my opinion, one of the best ways to interpret icons is to interpret them together, is not to isolate the icons and interpret them separately, but to interpret them as they relate to each other. And in the liturgical cycle, what comes after the entry into Jerusalem is the Bridegroom Matins. And for the service of the Bridegroom Matins, we bring out this icon, which is the icon of we call it the icon of the bridegroom, but it's based on several other icons. We'll go through them a little. But now all of a sudden what you see is this humiliated, beaten, tortured man. And so the contrast is very strong between the emperor that comes into the city and then suddenly, right away, and in some traditions, this icon will be brought out on the Sunday, on Palm Sunday, and will be put into the church right after the services that celebrate Palm Sunday. And so you have this contrast, which is here's the emperor, and then here is this beaten, tortured man. Now, again, in this icon, although it's like the opposite, you could say, of the entry to Jerusalem, just like in the entry of Jerusalem, there's this strange paradox about how it is that this king is going to end up ruling. Now, again, you see the same. He's obviously not just a tortured man, but he is a king, right? He is wearing a crown. He is holding a scepter. He is dressed in the purple. And so he is this king that has come into Jerusalem to rule. And so we see in this image the deep irony that is going to happen in Passion Week. These clashes of meaning that are going to be brought together that we discover in our hymnography. The opposites coming together is what we're seeing. And this image, it's interesting because this image is a rather late image. And there are even iconographers today that refuse to paint it because they say that it's a Western image. It's based on the Ecce Homo image that was developed in the West, where you see, Christ is taken out and say, here is the man. But it is nonetheless, even though it's a late image, it is based on very early types, which we call the King of Glory, which are similar, but show Christ going down into the tomb and having the elements of the crucifixion with him. And so they wouldn't have been related at the outset with Bridegroom Matins, but the elements of the bridegroom icon are there. And so what's fascinating about the bridegroom icon as well is that when you look at Bridegroom Matins, there's an eschatological motif, right? It's the parable of the 10 virgins that that have to have the oil in their lamps, and they have to be ready for the coming of the king. And there's this idea, right, of this final moment. There's this eschatological reality about it. But the icon that we use to celebrate it is this image. Here is your bridegroom, right? Here is your king. And the deep irony is present, and we'll see that go through all the icons of Holy Week. And that's the way that I want you to start to think about what happens during the Passion and what we see in the images of the icons of Holy Week. The next icon that we usually encounter in Holy Week is the washing of the feet. Again, in this image, we have this strange moment where the king, right, the same king that came into Jerusalem, is now humiliating himself and making him the servant of his disciples. And we see this paradox again represented in the image. I love, and oh, by the way, some of these are my carvings. I'm not good at pointing them out. Every time you see a carving, it's one of mine. Just I thought you could see some of the things that I do. And so here in the story, of course, of the washing of the feet, and in the image of the washing of the feet, you really you're playing with this tension. And it's a tension that's hard to, even in the decisions of the iconographer, it's difficult to know sometimes even how to do it. So Christ removes his garment and then washes the feet of the disciple. But in most of the traditions of this image, we also try to find some physical way to show that Christ is standing. And so in most of the images, he's standing, and they stack the disciples up, or they find some way to do it so that we don't know how to deal with this problem of which one is it? Is he the king? Is he the humiliated one? How do we do this? Because he is the Lord of Lords, he's the King of Kings, he's the Son of God, he's all these things, but now he's washing the feet. How do we signify that in the image without betraying something, without going too far in one way or the other? And so you see in most of the images of the washing of the feet, Christ is standing, the disciples are sitting, and he is washing their feet, though he's not completely prostrating himself before the disciples. And then you see, of course, in St. Peter's face that a wonderful expression of dismay, where he is completely dismayed at what is happening. He cannot understand what is going on. And again, this is ultimately the mystery of Holy Week. I think that in this image, we have the entire mystery of Christian hierarchy. Like, how does Christian authority function? Because we have this problem, and we're gonna see it all through the icons. Like we have this problem when we think of Christ, when we think of authority. How do we deal with it? We have on the one hand the image of Christ as the one who is the King of Kings and is this regal figure, but also Christ who goes to the marginalized, who helps who helps the poor, who heals the sick, who's constantly going to the lost sheep. So how do we reconcile this in the image? And I think in this particular image we have a powerful vision of Christian hierarchy, which is that Christ tells his disciples that he is going to wash their feet. And then the disciples don't say, well, it's about time, right? It's like, it's like we were waiting for this, finally he comes down from his high horse. No, the disciples are dismayed and are saying, no, like, you can't wash our feet. We should be washing your feet. That's how it's supposed to be. And then Christ then does the most wonderful thing ever, which is that he uses his authority to then serve them. He says, no, I'm the boss. I decide. Now shut up and let me wash your feet. Right? And so I think that that is one of the most powerful images of what authority in the Christian vision is, which is on the one hand, those that are leaders, they in love want to serve us, but we, as those who see our leaders, we also, want to serve them as well. And if we have that, if we can keep that deal going, then things go well. If they move too far in one direction or the other, then things start to go off track. And you see that in a family. It's like my children have to submit to me, but I'm supposed to love my children. If I don't love my children, at some point it's difficult to blame them from not wanting to listen to me, And so that balance is a very powerful, and it's an image, I think, of everything that happens in the icons of Holy Week and in Holy Week in general. And so I want to take a little detour and tell you about, my own. So when I made this image, because I was thinking about this problem, and so I did decide to make Christ kneeling. And there are some precedents for it. You can, when you're making icons, if you're going to do something a little different, you really have to shake. You have to be a little, for me at least, you have to be tentative and nervous about it. But I really felt like I wanted to show Christ kneeling as he washed his feet. We have examples in early Renaissance images of this. So this is an image by Duccio where you see Christ kneeling as he's washing the feet. And then one of the things, for example, that I wanted to do, which I've seen in other images, was, of course, to have Judas walking away as Christ is washing everybody's feet, and to kind of show him in side profile, which is one of the tropes that we see in icons. And so then the next image we have is an image of the Last Supper. Now again, we move in these extremes, which is on the one hand, you have Christ who humbles himself, who comes down and serves his disciple and becomes the servant of all. And then again, he becomes now, again, the head of the table. He becomes the high priest. He becomes the one who's running the show, and he's offering the meal to his disciples. And he's telling them what's going to happen. He's telling even St. Peter to take a sword. He is acting as the leader again. And so you see right even in the same event, right, in the same evening when they're in the upper room, that this deep paradox of Holy Week is playing itself out in the story, and is then also playing itself out in the images. This image that I carved, it's one of my very first commissions. I think it's like in 2012 that I carved this icon. And so it was very, very early. So I made it a strict copy of a famous icon from Vatopedi that I've loved for a decade before that I finally was able to carve it. And I was very, very grateful this year to have the chance to see the fresco at Vatopedi, just kind of stood there in front of it for way too long. Because the monks, they're not used to people just looking at the icon. At some point it become a little nervous, like, what is he? He's just standing there looking at the icon. But for me it was a great joy to see it. And in this particular fresco, and in some ways is one of those images that was the inspiration for my washing of the feet icon, because you can see that the way that I represented Judas in this icon is almost the same as the way that I represented him in the icon of the washing of the feet, with a certain look, with curly hair, and then also from on the side profile. All right. And of course, from the Holy Supper, then we come to the icon of the Crucifixion. Now, the image of the Crucifixion, the entire mystery of this contradiction or this clash of extremes is in its fullest representation, and we have to understand that it took quite a while for Christians to be willing to represent the crucifixion openly. You know, we do have early images of Christ on the cross from the 5th century. Usually there's an image on the door of Santa Sabina, very schematic, and there's also we have an ivory box from the 5th century. But it's not very, and they're struggling again with the problem. How do we do this? The first images, so here's a 6th century image of the crucifixion from the Rabula Gospel. You know, how do we represent this? And people are struggling with reason to know how to represent this deep mystery that is happening. And so the earliest representations of Christ, what they will do is they will show him on the cross with his eyes open and wearing a regal vestment, wearing a kind of royal vestment to cover his nakedness. And you can kind of understand why they're doing that, because what do we just represent him naked? Is that what we're supposed to do? How do we deal with this problem of the cross? Because it is, you know, we're so used to seeing crosses, we're so used to seeing crucifixes that we forget how scandalous this image is. It is so scandalous. Ultimately, what would happen, and there are stories of Western Christians coming to Constantinople in, I think, like 10th or 11th century, and witnessing some of the first images where Christ is shown with his eyes closed on the cross and slumped on the cross and being scandalized, like freaking out. You know, how is it that they're doing this? Ultimately, that image would end up being the image that we represent, but we never show people's eyes closed in icons. And we don't do that because it means they're dead. Like we're showing someone who's dead on the cross. And that's a very deep thing. Like, anyways, but on the cross and in the image of the cross, we really have all of this coming together, which is that Christ in this image brings together all the stories of the Old Testament, you know, all of these extremes into one. He is the king. It says so on the board above his head that he is the king. He is lifted up. You know, he's lifted up for all to see, both in glory and in shame. He is returning into the garden. And we know that he's returning into the garden because even in the icon will represent him, like I did, for example, in my version, where you see the two thieves. You see the good thief and the bad thief. And so you see Christ on the tree discerning good and evil. Right? That's what he's doing. And his nakedness is both the nakedness of the garden, but also the nakedness of shame, which comes after the fall. It's like it's a weird clash of all the images together. He kind of brings it together in one moment. And of course, you know, there are all these things that we could show in a crucifixion, but we have chosen mostly to show the Mother of God and St. John at his side. And why? Like, why are we doing that? There are probably plenty of reasons, but one of the reasons is that this is the beginning of the church. Right? The church is being born in the moment that Christ is closing his eyes. And so the world, you know, St. Maximus goes way further than I dare. St. Maximus says Christ is creating the world on the cross. You know, and so it's like when they pierced his side and the water and the blood came out, it is the water of the Garden of Eden that is flowing from his side. It is Eve that is bursting from his side. It is all these images of the beginning that is happening in the end. You know, when Christ says, I'm the Alpha, the Omega, he wasn't joking. Like, it really comes together in this particular image where you see Christ elevated and humiliated all at once, you know, spreading his hands out in order to gather the entire world into himself. as he is emptying himself out at the same time. And we always show, most of the time, when we show the crucifixion, we'll show the sun and the moon in the image. In mine, is it there in the mosaic? No, it's not. But in mine, you'll see the sun and the moon. In the Rebula Gospel one, you see it as well. If you look at the top of the image, you'll see the sun and the moon. And you can see that the early Christians knew that this was a cosmic event, that this was the center of the world, right? That the cross of Christ is the mountain, it is the pillar, it is the pillar that God was in Exodus. All of these images of anything that connects heaven and earth is ultimately brought together in the image of the cross. And then we show that in the icon, because what we show is we show the sun and the moon above with the angels above. When you see angels above, you always have to remember, we're so used to these images, right? So we have the angels above, and then below we have the skull of Adam, right, that is down below. But you could see that as the skull of Adam, of course, but you could just see it as death itself. Death is down below, and above you have the angels. But these are the same angels that sang at his birth. They're the patterns of the music of the spheres, the patterns of the heavens. Everything that is above is there, witnessing this cosmic event, which connects that world with this world below of death, and is just crashing them together in one image. But this image is mostly, of course, an image of a man being tortured on a cross. And so what will happen, I think, inevitably, is that we will ultimately this will lead to the image of the Anastasis, which we'll see. And those two have to be kind of held together in attention. We'll look at them when we get there. Now, these images, the images of the descent of the cross, are in some ways even more scandalous than the cross itself in terms of what is going on here. Here is the God-man being taken down, the limp body, and ultimately this image, I think, is probably one of the most difficult ones. Once again, we never show people horizontal in icons, right? Because when we show people horizontal in icons, it means that they're dead. And we usually don't show dead people in icons. I know that sounds weird, but we usually show, icons have an eschatological quality. We tend to show people alive in icons, because we represent their being. And so these images are very, very paradoxical and mysterious. To show Christ, lying down on the tomb, or lying down on the stone, is to really show the mystery of the incarnation and ultimately what it's coming. I think the only other image that we have that's similar to this is the Dormition, where we have the Mother of God lying down. I'm probably going to find more as I scan in my mind. But we very rarely show people really just dead in icons. And of course, people have pointed out that the image, sadly I didn't bring one, but that this image of Christ lying down, on the stone as he's being wrapped and being put into the tomb is parallel to the image of the Nativity, where Christ is also wrapped, already in the cave, as a prophecy or a promise of what the incarnation is about. And of course, as we know, this image is going to be used during the Paschal, during the funeral procession, where we have this icon, which is stitched on a piece of cloth, and then we carry it as we carry the body. Most people here are probably Orthodox, and you know that. But that this ends up being the very body of Christ that is cared for, that we take, that we venerate, that we bring out into the church to be venerated. And so it has a liturgical function in itself. It's not just an icon that we see on the wall like a fresco or a painting, but it becomes the very object, is part of the liturgy. It becomes a stand-in for the very body of Christ that we carry out and we bring out in order to be buried and to be venerated. And this leads, of course, to the image of the Anastasis. Now, I think, again, this image of the Anastasis shows us the same problem of Passion Week, which is we show Christ on the cross, and then we show that there is death below. Often we'll show, you can see the blood of Christ that is flowing down onto the skull of Adam below, right? And so what that's signifying is that what you're seeing on the outside here, what's secretly happening is this, which is what's visibly happening on the outside is Christ being humiliated, being subject to death. But that secretly, he is now, again, the great conqueror. He is now the emperor, he is now the king, and he is coming down into death as a hero, as a conqueror, as the emperor that's coming into his city in order to gather all of his and to take them out of death. And so you have this contrast again of, on the one hand, the deep humiliation, but on the other hand, the conquering that is happening simultaneously. And we always have to remember that on the cross, what you see with the blood dripping on the skull of Adam is Christ going down into death to get Adam. That's what's happening on the cross already. And so we separate it. Of course, we have the icon of the descent to Hades, and we have the crucifixion, but those two are happening simultaneously. Right? This is what is happening on the cross. The cross brings it all together, and now we separate it again. But here we really have, if you look at the image of Christ, he is a superhero in this image. You know, if you kind of, you see him like with often like the cape floating. If you try to imagine the scene, the way it's represented, you know, he's like flying into death and grabbing people and like just pulling them out of Hades, you know, and breaking the door open, and all of this really dramatic imagery of the conqueror of death coming into Hades to get his. But that is ultimately, all the images are playing between these two realities and how one ultimately is the reason for the other. And this is what I mean when I say that it's captured to some extent in the washing of the feet. It's captured to some extent in the image of the crown of thorns. You know, the image of the crown of thorns is also, to me, one of the most mysterious images in the Bible, because the thorns are a consequence of the fall, right? So when Adam and Eve sin, God says the earth will produce thorns. So they're a consequence of death. They are, in some ways, a reaction to death. Think about it like what thorns are. They're basically a defense mechanism. They're the plants protecting themselves from a dangerous world. And they're also the opposite of a mountain or a point. They're they're a breakdown of points where instead of having one point, you've got all these different points that are going in all kinds of directions. They really are an image of fragmentation, of violence, and all of that. But then Christ takes that and then makes it into his crown, you know. And it truly is a crown, right? It is a crown of glory. So you see this contradiction hinted at. And I think that really, that this is, I mean, it really is the mystery of what Christianity offers. And it's not, when you see it, you know, once Christ offered that to the world, it's understandable that it's a complete scandal. It's a complete scandal to present this. It's like, okay, so this guy who's tortured and mocked, this deep irony where we pretend he's the king. All of this strange giving up of himself, and then he's the king. Like, how does that work? But when you look at the image of the washing of feet, you can see that that's actually how reality works. Christ is actually exposing how the world functions. It's not just this arbitrary thing that we have to believe in just to whatever to be saved, but he is showing, he's revealing to the world how creation functions, which is that in order for someone to rule, in order for anything to rule, in order for it to rule properly, it necessarily has to empty itself. There's no other way for that to happen. And Christ is doing the opposite of what Adam and Eve did in the garden, which is instead of saying mine, instead of saying I own this, I'm in charge, I'm the one, I've got divinity, I can take it. He did the very opposite. Although he was God, he emptied himself, and he emptied out his presence into the world, and ultimately that's why he can be king. And it's in some ways the only legitimate king is the one that does that. Or else we have the problem that we have all the time, which is corruption, which is tyranny, which is all of these things. We have to deal with this as humans all the time. But we know, even in our own tradition, we know that the best bishops are always the ones that didn't want to be bishop. You know that the story of the monk that gets dragged out of the desert. We have so many of those stories in our tradition, and we know that that's actually how the world works. And what's amazing is in the juxtaposition of the icons of Holy Week, you seem to have this play between the two, which is on the one hand, the glorious king, and on the other hand, the one who empties himself, who humiliates himself, who descends, who becomes the smallest. And those are played against each other all during Holy Week to try to help you see the mystery of what is happening, which is that is actually how reality functioned. So, of course, the last image of Holy Week is the myrrh-bearing image. And again, you have these images of one of the things that I love about this image is how humble it is. We actually don't have a tradition of a resurrection icon in Orthodoxy. Everybody kind of knows that. We have later images, like 19th century images, but we don't actually have a tradition of a resurrection icon. And it's very fascinating because I think it again plays with this mystery of that which is this glorious aspect, which is hidden in the humble, which is hidden in the small, which is hidden in something which at the outset looks like the very opposite of what it is. And I think that it is captured in our icon of the resurrection, which is our icon of the resurrection isn't, our icon of the resurrection could have been the icon of Mary Magdalene, for example, seeing Christ in the garden. Although that icon kind of exists, it's not the one that's most liturgically used. This is the one that we celebrate with the Sunday of the myrrh-bearing women. And it's like, that's it. That's the image. There's a weird anticlimactic aspect to it, but I think that anticlimactic aspect is part of, again, the mystery of what the incarnation is doing, and that our image of the resurrection is an image of the empty tomb, right? Is an image of Christ no longer in the tomb. And if you think about, what we were shown before, this image, right, and this image, we can understand how this image of the empty tomb is this little sigh of relief in the end, this little and the fact that it's the women also that are there, it also has to do, I do believe it has to do with something about the secret of the resurrection. Because even in Scripture, the resurrection isn't described. It doesn't say, so he was lying in the tomb and then then he got up and he left. No, it's always described from the outside, and it's described in ways that is even contradictory, right? It's like the disciples don't recognize him, and then, they don't recognize him on the road. They don't recognize him. There's this way in which they were trying to diffuse even the resurrection itself, which is our central teaching. But there's something in the gospel that is wanting to say, hey, don't think you've got this. Like, don't think you master this. Like, you don't control this. This is something that that you have to approach with the type of reverence and hesitation and almost fear that you see in the women in the icon of the myrrh-bearing women. So what I want to propose to you is that in some ways, these two aspects that I mentioned to you, they are the key to understanding much of our iconographic tradition, which is, on the one hand, we have images in our iconographic canon, which are images that represent Christ as the glorious one, that Christ as the light that is shining, that everybody is seeing. We can think of the Transfiguration. We can think of the icon of baptism, theophany. There are many images like that represent this kind of glorious aspect of Christ. But we also have other images that seem to represent the making small, or the going in. And in that we have, of course, the icon of the Nativity. We have the icon of theophany has a bit of both, right? Because he's naked in the water. So there's something about that is also this kind of mystery. But you can understand these two extremes of Christ, which is both Christ in the dome of the church as the great judge, the one who comes in the end and rules over all of reality. But then at the same time, he is the innocent victim who was destroyed by authority. And that's the paradox. And that's in some ways why he can be the great king and the great judge, is because he went through all the injustice of what authority is. Because we have this problem right now in North America, in the world, as well, and even in Christianity, is that we have our Jesus. A lot of people have their Jesus, and many people like the victim Jesus. It's like the Jesus who is an unjust victim of a tyrannical and corrupt system, and the Jesus who is friends with the prostitutes, friends with the marginal people, and that is definitely Jesus. And there's some people who like the other Jesus, who like he's the Logos, he's the divine Logos. He decides what's true, he decides what's real, he rules over all reality, all knees will bow, everyone will confess that he is the Lord. And so you have this tension. But the reality is that they're the same. And if with only one, you don't get the full image of Christ, and with only the other, you do not get the full image of Christ. And if you don't have them together, then you have perversions of Christianity, ultimately, on one side or the other. And so we have this powerful testimony of Christ. And even the eschatological Christ, it's in the image of the heavenly Jerusalem. It's described that the Son of Man is ruling over the city. And there's this description of the Son of Man as the one sitting on the throne, and is ruling over all of reality. But also, he is also paired, with the Lamb that was sacrificed before the foundation of the world. And those two are together. They're the same person. And we need to keep them together, because that is the testimony that Christianity offers. That is the testimony that we have for the world, and it is the only manner that we as Christians can find each other. Because even we have to be able to see in others. If one of us is the Christian that likes the King Jesus, we have to know that the Christian that likes the victim Jesus, he's right. And the other way as well. And if we are able to do that, I do believe that we will find in the church a great solution to many of the problems that we're facing today. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Now, this portion of the program is going to be a Q&A with Jonathan and Dr. Timothy Patitsas, who we mentioned earlier. He's the Dean of Hellenic College and a professor of ethics, also the author of The Ethics of Beauty and co-founder of Beauty First Films. And maybe Dr. Tim and Jonathan can talk a little bit about how they know each other or other topics. And then after that, we'll take a few questions from the audience, but just a few to keep our spirits high, and then we'll have a nice reception outside where you can have a chance to share your thoughts afterward. So thank you all, and let's continue.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks, Tim.
Yeah. Do you want to say more right off the bat about this idea that it's just reality, that the only one that nothing can rule except it empties itself?
Yeah. Yeah, no, so this is really, I didn't want to go into it too much, but it is in some ways a technically true description, and this is something that I think the more that people study complexity and they study also patterns of cognitive science, they're realizing that that's actually how identity functions. That in fact, for things to exist, they always have to fit into higher participations, right? And this is, as Christians, it's like, oh yeah, we know that's true. But it's not just true morally, where we know that our goods have to stack up, and we have to, let's say, our goods have to participate in higher goods, or else they become idols that we can worship. But that seems to be actually how reality works itself. Because a simple example, like, it's like if I have a steering wheel, and the steering wheel doesn't give itself to its participation in the car, then it's ridiculous. It's a fetishized object that has no purpose. And that's how all things function. They always have to kind of give themselves up, empty themselves into their higher participations. And that seems to be actually the way that we perceive reality. And we're constantly moving as we engage with things. We're constantly moving between the particular of an experience. Like, if I'm drinking water, I have to both attend to my fingers, around the thing and the right pressure and everything, but ultimately I'm also attending to the fact that I'm thirsty, and ultimately I'm attending to the fact that if I don't drink, some point I'm going to die. Like there's a kind of hierarchy of goods that stack onto each other, and I think that this is the amazing thing about, I think, what Christ is revealing on the cross. I don't want it to feel like I'm diminishing what Christ is revealing. I think to the contrary, everything that we say morally about what Christ did is true, but it also happens to be a description of how the world works, and also things also have to give themselves down. They have to give themselves up into higher participation, but they also have to kind of give themselves down in a kind of flexibility towards variability. And so, like, I know it sounds technical, but it's like for a steering wheel to exist, it has to allow for variability of its existence. It has to allow for all kinds of steering wheels to exist. There can't just be one steering wheel. There has to be like a million possible steering wheels, But we all recognize them as a steering wheel, even though they're all different from each other. So identities always kind of give themselves down into their variability, but also give themselves up into participation into higher identities. And so I think that the incarnation, when St. Maximus talks about the fact that everything has a logos, all the logi are hidden behind all things in creation. There's a way in which right now in these different fields, they're discovering this to be true just about our experience of the world in general. It's a fractal, right? It's a fractal thing.
Sure. I'm going to ask another question. We'll see if there's any relation before we get to the audience. You hinted at this, or you stated it, that at the moment that the Roman soldiers thought they were mocking Christ by, pretend he's a fake king, they actually were revealing who he really was.
Yeah.
Does that work in our lives, or does that work? Or does that work in the lives of saints? That a moment where they're rejected, or because when I think of, for example, Saint Nectarius, because we've seen the movie Man of God, everyone's seen it. When he's rejected, how does that reveal that he's?
Yeah. So Jesus uses these images. He talks about the idea, right, that the stone that was rejected by the builders has become the head of the corner, has become the cornerstone or I always think it's a keystone. That's the best way to think about it, right? Then it's the stone that doesn't look like the others. And then once you finish the arch, then that's where it goes. It just holds the whole thing together. And so you have this image of the stumbling stone and the keystone, or the cornerstone. And that also seems to be a feature about reality, which is that the higher identities, like the higher things, when they peek into the world, they don't look like the flat world. They look different. And so they look like, that you can see it like the pearl in the field, right? You need the whole field, and then when you buy the whole field, then you can get the pearl. But the pearl isn't like the rest of the field. The field is full of rocks, but there's one thing in the field that shows its allegiance to some more value. And I think that's one of the problems that happens, is that people don't recognize that. Because people are looking flat, right? Their eyes are like this, and they just see the facts, but they can't recognize the one shining fact that is revealing the higher purpose of something. And so because of that, people tend to reject it, right? It's like the logo shines into the world, but the world does not recognize it. And that seems to be a sad fact of the fall, that we struggle to be able to capture. We get stuck in the mire of what we're doing, and we struggle to see the purpose. So I don't want it to sound, I hate when it sounds woo, when I say sounds woo. So this is something that you deal with all the time, right? Imagine you're in a job, and then people get caught up in the tasks that they're doing, and they forget the reason why they're doing something, and they don't know, but they're dying, and they don't even know that they're dying, because they're busy, and they're doing all these things, and they're super busy, but because they've forgotten their allegiance to a higher purpose, they're dying. And so you need someone to come, a prophet, even in your business, like a little prophet, not a prophet from God, but like a prophet from the purpose of the company, to come in and say, hey, wake up, folks. You're supposed to be doing this for this reason. You're not just doing a bunch of stuff. Like, there's a reason, But sometimes people hate that. They hate it because it's annoying, because I'm busy and I'm doing all these things. Why are you bothering me with this uppity stuff, And so, what Jesus described is something that there are things that we deal with all the time.
I feel like that would be a great T-shirt. People are dying, but they don't know they're dying because they're busy.
They're busy. Yeah. And you see that, that's definitely something that's happening.
Definitely get some looks as you went through the theme park or wherever.
They're dying. They don't know they're busy. Yeah, that's true.
So that sounds a little bit like the ugly duckling, right? Like the reason the duckling is ugly because it's a swan. I'm sorry if I gave that away to anyone who doesn't know the story. Spoiler alert.
That's right.
But I recall a story of a Romanian abbess who was absolutely loved and regarded as holy, and would disappear one day a week, and someone followed her to another part of Bucharest, where a very sort of rundown place where she sat in a gutter and people would just spit on her or something. It's like, what's that about? What was going on in her psychology?
So it does. The thing is that we have to be careful. Like, so you see it in the image of Christ. Like, in the image of Christ, you see the both. Christ always showing the both. It's like when Christ comes in Jerusalem, people love him. People recognize him. People see him as the king. And so sometimes that happens. Like, we have saints that are just saints, and everybody sees it, and they don't get persecuted, and they don't get, and then
that's my kind of saint.
That's what I want to be. I want to be that saint. I want to recognize his whole life. Like St. John Chrysostom, people just, loved him, and I mean, obviously he did get killed by the emperor, but but it's like people loved him, and people recognized him, and people. So you have both of those stories are possible, and I think in the story of Jesus, you have an aspect which shows you people seeing the king and recognizing the glorious one, and then also people being blind to them and being caught up in their passions and in their own distraction, and then not seeing him. So.
In that story, by the way, it seemed like the nuns then sort of rejected the abbess on that basis,
Really?
like at least mentally for a moment. Like, what is she? What is this? Yeah.
Like, why is it that saints tend to take the the contempt, like to take that on. I mean, they're definitely, they seem to be acting like Jesus, you know, and that we do seem to have the capacity to participate in what Jesus did. I hate to say it because I don't want to do that, but they seem to be able to take people's sins. And in taking them and forgiving them, they are healing the world somehow. And you see that. I mean, you see all these crazy stories of, you know, of abbots, you know, or you know, abbots of going and confessing sins to the novice, but it's the sin of the novice, and then the novice is hearing his own sin being confessed by the abbot, and is like he's taking the sin of the. And you hear like all these stories of saints who take the blame for other monks and stuff. So you know, it seems to be part of reality. It's kind of scary though, because like I said, I really don't want to do that. It's like, when I see it, I'm like, oh, that's amazing, but that's rough.
Should we go to the audience for questions now?
Sure,
because
sure,
I think they want to come to you directly, and I'll.
So does anybody have a question? I think there are 2 mics going through.
So it sounded like you said that the resurrection in the iconography and the scripture, it's not like directly portrayed often, but to me it seems like at least in the hymnography, it's very direct. You know, it's very explicit. You know the hymnography of Pascha, of course. You know how many times we say Christ is risen.
Well, of course, Christ is risen.
The place.
Yeah, of course, Christ is risen.
Yeah. So could you talk about like why in the hymnography it's like so direct, but in the iconography in the scriptures?
No, what I mean is that the resurrection itself is not portrayed.
Okay.
And so of course Christ is risen. And of course he does appear to the disciples and ultimately reveals himself completely, fully, where they all recognize him. But there seems to be something left of a mystery in the mechanism. It doesn't want to simplify the fact of it. Like it doesn't, in scripture it doesn't say, you know, he knocked on the door. I don't know like what he could say, like that he opened the tomb and he walked out. Or you see some Jesus movies that do that, and it's not good. Like there are some Jesus movies, they actually show him like in the tomb and then like sitting up. It's like, ooh, bad stuff. That's bad stuff. You know, and so yeah, and I think I mean I can't completely explain why that is, but there seems to be something about the resurrection that is meant to be kept mysterious. You know, not that it didn't happen, but that it can't be reduced to a phenomena that we can reproduce. Let's say that we could analyze and put it in a laboratory and say, here's how the resurrection works.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great to see you again.
It's good to see you, Father. Yes.
I think you gave the answer in your talk, and you were trying to keep that tension between the two. In other words, is he the king? Is he the humiliated one?
Yeah.
And I think the reason the church doesn't show, and when you say resurrection, you mean his resurrection coming out of the tomb. And I think there's a good reason for that. And the reason is exactly what you showed us. Because there's a danger of that becoming a form of Nestorianism. Why? Because when you see the resurrection, you don't have the other image that you showed. In other words, the humiliation. Mm. Because the whole thing is that it needs to be, that's why the earliest icons of the resurrection were the crucifixion, like the Rabula depictions, where you have the crucified and risen one. In other words, the danger is to, like you said, if you get rid of that balance, you have heresy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The danger is to say, okay, he's divine and human, and the human part died, and then the divine part by itself rose. Of course he rose, because he's God.
He's God, yeah.
But then, first of all, you're dividing him into two people, in a sense, but also the church, I believe, sees there's a danger there, because then it doesn't matter to us. In other words, that's his thing. It's not our resurrection. And the resurrection icon that finally came about basically is our resurrection.
That's right. Yeah.
So, because you said the eschatological aspect is always there, and that's very important, because art historians want to always look from a Western point of view, a Renaissance point of view. Oh, it must be a picture, it must be a depiction of something in the past, and therefore they say, because you never see that. It always is Anastasis. Anastasis means resurrection, and resurrection is a physical resurrection, and he's not alone in the Orthodox icon, whereas the Westerners will have the banner and he's by himself. But that's not described in the Gospels for good reason. And you have earlier, before the final Anastasis icon developed, you have, besides the empty tomb that you showed, you have other depictions of basically an empty tomb, like a house.
Yeah.
Maybe you've seen it. There's the old marbles of that. Again, you don't have Christ by himself resurrecting, because that can be misconstrued as, oh, of course he's God, and that doesn't affect me. So in a sense, it's the danger of that separation of the one mystery, because our theology starts from, as your icon so beautifully showed, he is the crucified and risen one. In one action, trampling upon death by death.
Yeah.
And that's why all your icons showed both. Yeah. And once you separate that, then you have a problem. Because then it becomes something that is made superficial, in the sense that you lose that radical newness. Well, Western, I'm not pointing fingers, but it's a theological statement. When you don't have this in the Pascha, the Easter just passed, did you know that it happened? I mean, in a sense, you see bunny rabbits, you see chocolate, but is it an existential event? It's not, because if you have Christ coming out of the tomb, then in a sense it's his thing. See, I got back at you guys. I'm God, of course, and I rose. But that other side, the humiliation side, is not there. Yeah. So I think that's what the church is always keeping those two things together. And the earliest celebration of Pascha was a one-night vigil, where all these things were celebrated together. The crucifixion, the death, and the resurrection. And that's why we say trampling upon death by death. And Pascha means suffering. Pascha also means resurrection. And that's why all your icons showed that whole mystery being always depicted together. In other words, held together. Yeah. And you made that point, and I think that's the answer to the question, really.
That's a great insight. And I love the idea that the Anastasis icon is our resurrection, because when you look at images of the Last Judgment, you see, like when Christ picks up Adam and Eve, he's bringing them to the Last Judgment, and you see them in the icon of the Last Judgment, kneeling before the prepared throne. It's like, that's it. It is already our resurrection.
You've seen the depiction in, I think it's Torcello or Porridge, near Venice, where
I did a whole talk on that.
Yeah, and on top is the resurrection. Yeah. So it's the end times. Yeah, it's all eschatological.
I totally agree.
And plus, you're never going to see that emblem, ikathos is adu. It doesn't exist. It's an us, and resurrection means a resurrection. And he's pulling them. You're an artist. He's pulling them behind the wrist. It's physical. They're heavy. In other words, it's a physical resurrection, because then we spiritualize it, and then it becomes chocolate and bunny rabbits.
Hello, thank you for coming today. It was a very compelling talk. To kind of bounce off what you said earlier, and to continue Father's point of splitting the image of Christ as being the king and the servant, and that kind of sparked to mind like how sometimes in Catholicism they overemphasize the servant part with, like, for example, Francis of Assisi, and the over-exaggeration of like the imagery of the suffering, and then also with like bringing to the Protestants the overemphasis of the king, the judge, the one that rules everybody. And it seems like in Orthodoxy, they always bring it together. They have the two in unity. And I feel like that's kind of a theme in like the other faith, like denominations, is like the Catholics and the Protestants kind of take one thing from Orthodoxy, but they don't have the complete truth. It's like a form of Nestorianism. They split them. And I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I would say it depends. Like, Orthodoxy has had a tendency to focus on the imperial aspect, especially when Byzantine Empire was quite strong. The image of the Christ as emperor was was more prominent in the East, and the cross was less prominent. And so I do believe that in the theology and in the mystery we do have that joining together, but the Orthodox are not immune from excess, sadly. We wish we were, but the Holy Spirit does the work over the long term and kind of brings things together ultimately. But there are moments when we have tended to emphasize the imperial aspect of Christ quite a lot. So.
Hi,
Hello.
thank you so much for your speech. One of my questions is kind of relating to that, but if we take the Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew, and bring the Hebraic emphasis onto this, so for example, the word gospel comes from basar, and basar literally means flesh. So the word gospel is tied to this Hebrew idea already that is existing in the Old Testament. So the fleshiness of God, the blood, the water, the thorns, all the imageries that you mentioned from the Old Testament, maybe if we, now that we have a chance to have concordances in the way that the fathers and some of the iconographers did not have a chance to. So if we reread the Passion Week, but using the Septuagint, but referring back again and again to the Hebrew words, because that's the foundation of whatever is happening in the New Testament. So do you think icons and our perception, or what we're being scandalized about, seeing too much of the fleshiness maybe, or maybe we're ignoring the imperial side too much? What do you think bringing the Hebraic, direct Hebrew words onto the Passion narrative, how that would affect iconography? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I believe that we do have I think that we do have that tradition in the church. I mean, through the Syrian fathers, we have this whole Hebraic thought that fed into the Orthodox world, and if you read Saint Ephrem and you read Saint Isaac, you see that they're deeply thinking in Hebraic terms. So I think it's there in the church. I'm always worried about, our gospel is written in Greek, and so I'm always worried about attempts to want to then too simply, like speculate about what it's translating in Hebrew. I mean, it's not completely useless, but I'm always careful because, it is a bit speculative, and I would tend to take, I have a great love of Saint Ephrem. He's obviously one of my great go-to people, and so that's how I tend to do it, and see, but I'm not, I'm not against the idea, but I would say it would have to be done cautiously,
Yeah, thanks for the great talk.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes. So you started your talk by saying that Jesus came to conquer the Roman Empire, and then you had my attention because obviously I'm interested in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, of course, because you're a man.
Yeah, exactly. But I also, throughout the talk, I tried to look at the images as somebody living in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. And of course, these icons didn't exist, but the mental images existed and were circulating. So I thought that the images themselves are very controversial, right? Because you have this Roman Empire that portrays emperors and warriors as godlike, and then you have somebody, Jesus, that is exactly the opposite. So, and we had also earlier somebody brought it up that, and you also, that many people prefer the humiliating Jesus. So I was asking myself, and I want your take on this: did he conquer Rome as a king or as somebody who was humiliated?
No, he did both. I mean, it was both at the same time. When St. Paul, it's so crazy to read, for example, to know that these texts were written, hundreds of years before Rome became Christian. St. Paul, I forget in which passage he says, right now, he is ascending, he is conquering the principalities, he's saying, like, Christ, you don't see it, but Christ right now, he's conquering the world. He's actually going up the hierarchy. He's subjugating all these principalities to himself. All of these kingdoms are being submitted to him, and you don't see it, but it's happening. And then ultimately, you know, a few hundred years later, then the fruits appear, you know, and the image of, and we have to remember that the image of the kingly, like the Son of Man image, is not just in Revelation, right? It's there all through the prophetic literature, but the mystery of Christ is to join the image of the suffering servant and all of this image of the lowly descriptions of the Messiah in Scripture. So like Joseph, right? So Joseph gets cast out into Egypt. He's persecuted by his brothers. He's chased, you know, his brothers want to kill him. All of this stuff is going on. You know, he's end up being a prisoner in a foreign land. All of this is happening. That's an image of the Messiah. Okay. And then it's like, oh, and then there's also this David figure who is like, he plans a temple. He's the ruling king. He's this great conquering hero. And it's like, that's also an image of the Messiah. And it's like, okay, well, how do you fit those two together? You know, and that's the mystery. That's one of the mysteries of Christ, is that he shatters that. You know, he brings it all together into one opposite, with these two opposites together. And so I believe that Christ, you know, that Christ conquered the Roman Empire both as a servant and as a king, just like he did just as he was in his own life.
The image of one sows and another reaps, although in this case, Christ is the sower and 3 centuries later, the reaper.
The reaper, yeah.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, so I can't, wherever. You're doing a great job, microphone people. Keep it up.
Thank you, Jonathan, for being here. We've all looked forward to it, and we hope to see you back very soon again. I wanted to see if you would comment on the bridegroom icon, specifically the image of the reed and the icon. So I know we have the prophecy in Isaiah about bruised reed he shall not break, but is there anything specifically about the reed and the scepter and the properties of those two things that make them fit for that icon?
Yeah, I'd never thought about it enough. I don't think I have. There's definitely something there. There's definitely something. There has to be an analogy between the crown of thorns and the kingly crown, and the reed and the scepter. There has to be an analogy there, but I'm afraid that I don't completely see it. But I'm on to it now, so I'm gonna think about it. But there has to be, because it's so striking, you know.
But you have to footnote that question when you write it out.
I just put it back in there.
Yeah, so I was noticing when you were talking about, sorry. When you mentioned earlier about Christ emptying himself and how that makes him the only legitimate king, it occurred to me that that has a lot of parallels. I don't know how familiar you are with Taoism, but there's a number of parallels there. I was just hoping maybe you would talk a little bit about some of those parallels and kind of reconciling that continuity.
Yeah, I don't know Taoism enough to be able to make that comparison. You know, I know that there's a wonderful book on Christ and the Tao that has been written, and C.S. Lewis seemed to have seen also a very strong relationship between the Logos and the Tao, and so it is definitely quite possible that the Taoists had an intuition about. I mean, the thing about once you realize that Christ, that the divine Logos created the world, it's not shocking to realize that people would have had intuitions about that before he came, because that's actually how the world works. And so, you know, if there were people that were pure of heart, if there were people that were, you know, that were not taken up by their passions, then they would have had intuitions about the same things that we teach. To me, that's not surprising. It's that, you know, it's this whole idea of Justin Martyr's, you know, logos spermatikos, like this idea of Christ hidden in the world and hidden in reality, because he is the source. He's upholding the world. And so, to me, the idea that the Taoists or that other traditions would have would have captured some element of the Logos and how that works, is not only is it not surprising, but it just seems like completely inevitable, you know. And that's why, like, you know, we have this idea of people, of Christianity imposing itself, and sometimes it has, but many, many times it didn't. It basically was like a last key to the puzzle of other people's traditions. You know, there are even many Aboriginal, native tribes, and when they heard the story of Jesus, you're like, oh, yeah, of course, that fits. It's like it ties everything together. You know, we have these traditions, and then it's like, cool, here's the key. You know, the Gallic people converted like that. We don't like right away. They just converted, and so I think that's true. So
I feel like there's one more person who's gonna just burst if they don't ask that final question. So who is that person? Is it someone down there, maybe, in the white sweater? There, or someone over here? And this is the final one because.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Nice to see you up there. So I just had a general question. If, as an expert, if you could explain the relationship between iconography and for the individual in terms of meaning, and what would you advise someone new to knowing Christ? Is there a specific image that you would suggest looking at, or anything that you've known to be really impactful?
Well, the icon of Christ is the central image. Everything is in that image. You know, it's just the icon of Christ, who's there. He's blessing with his right hand. He holds a book in his left hand. All of iconography is gathered into that image. You know, people often ask me, like, I'd like to commission one icon. Which one should it be? It's like, if you're going to just commission one icon, that's the icon you should commission, because you know, you can have an icon corner with 1,000 icons, or you can have an icon corner with the icon of Christ. If you have the icon of Christ, it's all gathered into that one image. So that's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Well, very sadly and reluctantly, we've got to wrap up for tonight. Jonathan, thank you very much for coming. I don't know if you have one last word you want to say, or.
Well, I want to thank Holy Cross for coming. You know, it's been great. I was able to come with my wife and my daughter, and you know, you all received them wonderfully, beautifully. I was really happy to see, you know, my family making relationships, and even my daughter, you know, talking to students and all of that. That's been, for me, that's been a great joy. So I'm happy to have been able to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, everyone. Good night.